Hello Year 9, welcome to your homework for Term 2. Now in your lessons quite soon you're going to be learning about how in the years immediately following World War I, women in Britain, or some women in Britain anyway to start off with, were given the right to vote. They were granted suffrage. So suffrage is another word for the right to vote. And it was in 1918 in Britain, the Representation of the People Act went through Parliament, and it meant that women over the age of 30 could vote. It was unfair because men over the age of 21 could vote at that time, but women only over the age of 30. And like I say, we're going to be learning about that in class. But what I want you to understand before we do that, and this is what your homework's going to be about, is that Britain wasn't the first country to grant women's suffrage at all. And in fact, if we look at a country right on the other side of the world, New Zealand, down here, women in New Zealand, by the time women in Britain got the vote for the first time in 1918, women in New Zealand had already had the vote for 25 years. And that's what our homework's going to be on now. So, why had women in New Zealand had the vote since 1893? Well, New Zealand was part of the British Empire, so it's interesting to think, why would women in New Zealand have the vote but not women in Britain if they're both part of the same empire? Well, New Zealand was a self-governing colony. So although Britain controlled certain areas like foreign policy and whether they were at war with other countries like Germany, which of course they were between 1914 and 18, just like Britain was. Many New Zealand soldiers came and fought in that conflict. They were self-governing in other areas in the laws of New Zealand, so they could make their own laws. And in the 1860s to the 1870s, a group of women called the Women's Christian Temperance Union began campaigning for women to have the right to vote. And the reason they started to do this, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the word temperance is a reference to alcohol, or rather, not having alcohol. This was a big movement all over the world at this time, a kind of anti-alcohol campaigning movement that a lot of the time was led by women, because I suppose women quite often bore the consequences of alcohol abuse, either through domestic violence or through their husbands who had all the rights and all the economic power in the household, either spending money on alcohol. So a lot of women wanted to campaign against alcohol use, and one way they thought they might be able to do this, these women in the Women's Christian Temperance Union, they thought if they could get the right to vote, then maybe the country could ban alcohol completely, they could prohibit it. This is something that other countries have tried at different times in history. You'll be learning in another topic later in Year 9 how America tried this in around the same time as well. They prohibited alcohol for a few years. As you could also tell by their name, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, they were also motivated by religion. You know, they sort of disapproved of alcohol on Christian grounds as well. So that was what started this group off. They wanted women to have the right to vote, to bring an end to alcohol being allowed in New Zealand. And one woman who came to the fore in this movement was called Kate Shepherd. She was originally from Britain, from Liverpool. She migrated to New Zealand in the 1860s, and she kind of rose up through the ranks of the Women's Christian Temperance Union and became the foremost campaigner in that country for women to get the right to vote, to get suffrage. And she would write to newspapers, she would write to members of parliament, she would give speeches and do everything she could to try and gain support for what she saw as a change that needed to be made. Of course, there was a lot of opposition to the work she was doing. A lot of men, and some women as well, but a lot of men in New Zealand thought women should be confined to what's called the domestic sphere. So they should be left at home to look after children, to cook and clean. They shouldn't be involved in politics, and they certainly shouldn't be entrusted with the right to vote. So she ran into a lot of opposition with the work she did. But she persevered. Kate Shepherd persevered. She got a petition together calling for the right to vote. It got 32,000 signatures on it. And she took it to the New Zealand Parliament. It was so long, this petition, this huge roll of paper with 32,000 signatures on it, 270 metres long. So she took it into the Parliament and she unrolled it down the floor in the middle of the chamber, which is a really sort of dramatic way of showing just how much support there was for this idea of women getting the vote. And even though the Prime Minister himself was against the idea, Parliament voted on it in New Zealand, and in 1893 the Electoral Act was passed, which gave women the right to vote. This was the first time any country in the world had granted women the right to vote. Now, Kate Sheppard lived a long life. She didn't just stop campaigning when women gained suffrage in New Zealand. She had many more campaigns to go. She campaigned for women to have access to contraception. She campaigned for an end to the corset, you know, the really uncomfortable and tight undergarment that women were expected to wear in the late Victorian period to try and make them sort of look thin and attractive. It was very uncomfortable and meant you couldn't breathe properly. She campaigned for an end to that, and she died in 1934 at the ripe old age of 86. So, your work is to, I want you first of all to create a poster about Kate Sheppard. There's all the information I've just told you about her in this video. I've also typed it all up underneath as well, so I want details in there. What did she do? What was she motivated by? Have a picture of her, which you can either copy and paste or you can draw your own. I want some really vivid and beautiful work looking at Kate Sheppard and her importance. So that's the first task, create a poster about her. The second task, underneath all of this, there's a source, a leaflet that was produced by an opponent of Kate Sheppard, someone who thought that women should not get the right to vote in New Zealand. I want you to read through that source. It talks about epicene women. I want you to look up what that word epicene means, and then think about what this source tells us about the opposition that campaigners such as Kate Sheppard faced. And then if you've still got an appetite to learn more after doing those two things, then there's an extension task at the bottom. There's an interview with the current Prime Minister of New Zealand, who has said that she's inspired by the example of Kate Sheppard. I'd like you to read that interview and then share your thoughts on that and how the past is still affecting the present in that country in terms of its politics. Okay, I hope you enjoy all the tasks. Good luck with them, and I'll see you later.